basic question to the average person that's never read the book, and I got a lot of things I want to get into. I want to talk to you about the economy. You know, does it ever happen when we don't go through all the foreturning? Different stages. Is the currency about to change? How much of it has to do with values and principles changing? But if you don't mind just taking a moment, first, what inspired you want to write this book, and what are actually the 4 different turnings?
Okay. Bill and I should say Bill Strauss was my co-author for many years. He passed away about 11 years ago. We started writing in the late 1980s. So this has been an alternative career. I mean, partly I've been a policy guy. I actually wrote my first book, co-authored with Pete Peterson, founder of Blackstone Group. But we did a lot of stuff on debt, deficits, entitlement, what the hell's going to the federal budget. I'm the kind of guy who reads the latest CBO report, and I weep. You know what I mean? The next 10 years, the next 30 years, what's going on in the federal budget? I mean, it's bad. It's much worse than it actually looks on the paper. But I still have that in me, right? I've done this for so many years, looked at budget projections. But my other career...
Is there such a thing as budget projections today? I mean, who's doing it today in Congress? They're not sitting there counting when we're going to stop spending money and paying it off.
No, what they do is they just say current law.
Yeah, another $2 trillion, another $2.1 trillion.
It is disastrous, and no one can do anything, right? I mean, there's just complete paralysis. But my other career was looking at generational change. So I didn't, my study, my field in graduate school was history and economics. But so Bill and I were really interested in generational differences. Why are generations different? Boomers are so different from their parents. Xers are different from boomers. Millennials, you know what I mean? We went back and wrote an entire history of America as a sequence of generational biographies. That was our book, Generation. So we started in the 1630s with a great migration to New England of the Puritans, the first old world, sizable migration to New England. Their city on a hill, they called each other saints. I mean, this was a very idealistic enterprise. And then they had their kids who were called Cavaliers, who didn't understand, Mom, Dad, why the hell did you bring us up to this godforsaken wilderness? They look back at England, they saw, gold, pedigree, all kinds of riches to be made. Yeah. These generational differences have been with us throughout, Patrick, our entire history. Different generations see each other differently because they have a different location in history. So that was what we figured out. And then we found something we didn't expect. We did not go in here looking for a cycle of history, anything like that. What we didn't expect is that these generational differences came in patterns. Certain kinds of generations always follow other generations. After the Puritans came the Cavaliers. After the Transcendental generation, they came of age with the Second Great Awakening. This would have been the peers of Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau and all those poets and commune founders and feminists. And I mean, they came of age in the 1830s. And the generation that came after them got the name Gilded Generation. They bore the brunt of the Civil War. They were a generation of metal and muscle. They really didn't say very much. But again, that kind of shift, right? You look at the shift from idealism to pragmatism, survival coming right after it. And there are other patterns too. That pattern made us reflect on something else. If generations come in patterns, then the history that shapes generations must also come in patterns. And that got us to reflect on a very basic pattern that historians have often noticed. And that is about once every long human lifetime, we basically reshape our civic institutions, our outer world of politics, infrastructure, the economy, our constitution, and usually in violent organized conflict, right? So this really started in the last quarter of the 17th century. This was the era of Bacon's Rebellion, the Glorious Revolution, King Philip's War. It's what Thomas Jefferson later looked back and he said, 100 years before 1776 was the first real American Revolution. That was Bacon's Rebellion. But this was an extraordinarily violent reshaping of the colonial identity. And then, of course, a lifetime later came the American Revolution. A lifetime later came the Civil War. A lifetime later came the New Deal, the Great Depression, World War II. And a lifetime later, here we are, Patrick, right? And what's interesting is that roughly halfway in between these, what I consider to be outer world upheavals, when our institutions are basically, our sense of community is being creatively destroyed. We have what historians call the Great Awakenings of American history. And very conveniently, historians number them. They talk about the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening. Mm-hmm. Probably the fourth or fifth Great Awakening was the late 60s, 70s, early 80s, when boomers were coming of age. And these are periods when we don't remake the outer world, we remake the inner world of religion, values, culture. Now, this basic yin and yang rhythm has coursed throughout American history. Historians often don't pay attention to it because they don't, political historians don't really value looking at religion. Religious historians don't really, you know what I mean? This requires a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary perspective. And it gives rise to this idea of four turnings, during each of which a new generation is coming of age, and each generation is sort of moving up to another phase of life. And we have rising adults moving into midlife, midlifers moving into elderhood, mm-hmm. and so on. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you a tour through the first four turnings, and then we can proceed.
Sure.
Let's look at what I think is most familiar to Americans on a long cycle, and that would be what happened after World War II. Historian William O'Neill called this the American high, right? This would have been the presidencies of Truman, Eisenhower, John Kennedy, 1946 to 63. Let's just think mm-hmm. of it that way. It was an era when institutions were strong, individualism was weak, people had a strong consensus about where the nation should go. People in America felt like they were more that they were, the sum of what they were was more than each part individually. In other words, in an aggregate, they mattered more than
collective.
Exactly. A sense of strong collective. People were modest about their individual talents or their individual rights, and everyone had a job to do. You were a boy in school, people said, go out and be a breadwinner. You were a girl, they said, be a homemaker. Everyone had a role to do. This is typical of a high. In fact, it's typical of every post-crisis generation. And the generation coming of age in that era was the silent generation. These were the kids who had been children in World War II and the Great Depression. This would have been, we have very few of them in politics left. Who remembers World War II still in politics? Joe Biden? Yeah, he remembers it. He's old enough. Mitch McConnell? That's about it.
And some would question whether they remember it or not, but because their current state. But that's
the problem is it may be all he remembers.
Yeah,
but that's another way of saying it. But my point is that shaped them. And these tend to be pretty conformist young people. Mm-hmm. We had universal conscription in the 1950s, and there wasn't a single kid who rebelled. Elvis Presley called into the army. Yes, sir. Shaved his hair, was off to Germany. I mean, the next generation, all that would change, right? Okay, so that is the high. Community strong, individualism was weak. The second turning is the awakening. And this is a time when the post-crisis generation is starting to come of age. There would be boomers in the latest case. By the way, I mentioned the second Great Awakening. That was a generation that was born and raised just after the Republic was founded. So you got the rhythm now. These are the kids raised in the peace, plenty, and orderly prosperity that came after the crisis.
Low chaos, not a lot of crisis.
Exactly.
It's chill.
Right.
Pretty peaceful. You can be creative if you want to. That's this phase.
Yeah, well, there's nothing. Yeah, you could be creative, but no one will allow you to do it, right? That's the problem. You have to be a member of the system, right? I mean, they have all this inner creativity born through all that stability and affluence, but they don't have there's no way to express it because you're supposed to be part of the system. So you have Mario Savio, free speech movement, 1964, saying we need to throw ourselves on the gears of the system. That famous speech on Sproul Plaza in UC Berkeley, to throw ourselves in the gears of the system to stop it, right? And that started this whole boomer awakening. That started this. What you do in an awakening is you want to throw off all the social conformity. You want to throw off all this overriding sense of community. We don't need to be building so much anymore. Your parents went through the crisis and they were programmed to just keep building and make institutions stronger. Why? Why? We don't no longer need it, Mom and Dad, right? So I think that in the most recent context, it started mainly on the left, on college campuses. It was, protesting the patriarchy and sex role divisions and how you dress and how you talked and all that stuff. But I think at the later end, in the 1970s, with Prop 13 and the Reagan movement, it was more the right that got in on this. Cut our taxes, cut regulation. But here is what it all had in common, left and right. The individual should do whatever the hell he wants. We don't need this community. The boomers was raised at a time of maximum equality in terms of income and wealth. You look at the Gini coefficients, you look at any of the data, that's just when everyone agrees that we had the most maximum, income and wealth equality, late 60s. And they hated it, right? It was the strong middle class. It was these little boxes that all looked the same. Remember that Melvina Reynolds song? It was Pleasant Valley Sunday, charcoal burning everywhere. It's the boomers' worst nightmare. Why? Let people go their own way. I think boomers over their lifetime have been very accepting and indulgent of growing income inequality. I think that has been, every individual can do his or her own thing, right? And
is that a mindset of libertarianism, like the DNA of libertarian?
And it's not necessarily they wanted inequality. What they wanted was the freedom of every individual to choose whatever they wanted to do.
And do you know when the Libertarian Party got started? 1971.
Well, there you go, right in the middle of the awakening.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying, which makes sense. Rob, did you see that? So Libertarian Party, if you look it up, 1971. Right.
But what you got is that boomers they didn't want defined benefit pension plans. Define contribution. Contribute if you want. Don't contribute if you don't. Everything should be your choice. And of course, boomers end up, a lot of them didn't contribute. They borrowed against it. They never rolled it over. So all these boomers now are unprotected going into retirement. So it's had all these consequences, but the boomer ethos was the institution shouldn't be responsible for you. Just, everything would be okay if people had more freedom. And they really mastermind. I think most of the tirades against boomers have emphasized this. Most recently, I can't remember the author. It was that Exer Gibney, the guy who was one of the PayPal founders, one of the guys in California, wrote a book a couple of years ago called "A Generation of Sociopaths." I think one of the most scathing screeds against boomers as a generation. He points this out, right? Boomers never wanted to work on continuing the community-oriented institutions that brought us together. They started the trend. Okay, so that's the awakening. Now, what's the third turning? The third turning is the unraveling. And that, in the most recent context, would have started in the mid-1980s, Morning Again in America, probably gone all the way through to the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis, 2008. What was that era? Well, think about it. The high, banding together, building things, being a stronger community. Took the lessons from the recent crisis, right? And everyone is scared. You got to circle your wagons. You got to, we might go back into a crisis. The awakening comes, and then the unraveling, you take the lessons of the recent awakening. What do you need to do to be happy and fulfilled? Be an individual, right? So the unraveling is sort of the maximum individualizing of American society, and that was when Gen X was coming of age, right? And Gen Xers were the ultimate throwaway generation as kids. I mean, they were individuals from the time they were 3. These were the first kids that people took pills not to have. They were alone at home. They were the alone at home generation, right? And you can notice that the words that have followed Xers in the pop culture, words like reality, survivor, right? Think about that. Think of those black shirts they used to wear, with the die yuppie scum, back in 1970, and the very different kind of actors and actresses, a very different impression that they had in Hollywood when they came of age, almost traumatized, not really acting up so much as boomers. For Xers, individualism wasn't a discovery. It was just a fact of life at the time they were kids, right? I mean, you were on your own. And you were expected to grow up really quick. And this is the mood of the unraveling. Maximum individualism. These often feature wild market euphorias, like in the 1990s, the dot-com bubble, I think, has gone down in history. This is also the 20s. You think about the famous decades in third turnings in American history, you're talking about decades of cynicism, bad manners, and very weak civic instincts. I'm thinking about the 1990s, the 1920s, the 1850s, the 1760s. These are wild decades where we didn't think we had any kind of civic core in America. And I would say the book which gave the best sense of direction of the 1990s was written by Francis Fukuyama. It was called The End of History. And you read that book, and it's all the big institutions are going to fade away. All the authoritarians and dictators were going to collapse, right? And there'd just be individuals transacting with each other on the internet. You'd go into a Starbucks, get out your laptop, and just transact with people around the world, and all your 1,000,001 wants would be satisfied. No sense of community in that vision at all, right? That's where we were. But history says the third turning is always followed by the fourth turning. And the fourth turning is that process. It's dark. It's violent, usually, but it's where we refine community. And I think one thing that's fascinating, and in this latest book I wrote last year, The Fourth Turning is Here, is I look at how familiar we are in knowing how a society goes from community to individualism, because in our own human lifetimes we've all lived it. But clearly, there's got to be another direction history often goes, right? It's got to go from individualism to community. None of us have any familiarity with that because it's beyond our lifetime, right? That was the last fourth turning. But hardly anyone is, almost everyone who lived through that is too old to tell us about it. But that's what I want to focus on, because we are now in the fourth turning, and its most climactic moments, we have about a decade to go. Its most climactic moments are ahead of us.
In these uncertain times, if there's anything we need people to believe the future looks bright. So if you've heard about me saying this mission to you, we're on a mission to get 1 million people to wear this gear, and this is what we're doing. If you buy one of these hats, there's a category of buying one hat, getting the second one free. If you haven't yet worn this gear publicly, go ahead and test it out. Buy some of the gear, wear it in public, and see how many people will stop by and say, you also watch Valuetainment? You also follow PBD Podcast? I do too. Place your order. Go to vtmerch.com, click on the link above or below, place your order, and represent the VT and the PBD Podcast gear.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.